Ocean divides the United States from Mexico, Caribbean nations, and Central and South America. Although the existence of this boundary is far more recent than many of the populations it divides, it causes certain Latinx communities to identify not only as distinctly Latinx in the United States, but also as immigrants. Public perceptions and portrayals of this Latinx immigrant identity, perpetuated commonly by the American press, are subject to remolding and remodeling, processes taken out of the hands of the Latinx immigrants that they affect most directly. Instead, white citizens who do not view themselves as immigrants control the creation and circulation of stereotypes about Latinx immigrants, using them as negative pillars to define themselves against. In the Cuban Revolution of 1959, U.S.-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown by Fidel Castro and a communist regime was established, causing many lighter-skinned, wealthier, more educated, white-collar Cuban professionals to flee Cuba. Disempowered by their new government, often even fearing persecution for ties to the Batista regime, these Cuban elites benefited from U.S. policies that, based in extreme Cold War opposition to communism, welcomed Cuban immigrants fleeing communism. For the following 2 decades, steady immigration from Cuba persisted, and although the Cuban immigrant population did diversify as more Cubans became disillusioned with communism in practice, it remained disproportionately representative of racially and socioeconomically privileged Cubans. In a U.S. climate of acute hostility to communism, these immigrants received glowing praise in the American press. A 1976 article titled "Cuban Refugees and the American Dream" shows the prevalence of rhetoric that praised Cuban immigrants for rejecting communism to embody American capitalist ideals. The article told the story of Jose Barred, who used to park his old Buick in a Miami cemetery because he had no other place to sleep. Today, it states, he and a fellow countryman, Jose Kobe, own the 4th largest engineering corporation in Florida. He has appeared on the cover of Money magazine at the helm of his own yacht. This anecdote, as well as the described successful transitions of Cuban American immigrants to the United States, is attributed to their affinity for traditional American morality, defined in the article as strong home and family ties and high priority placed on education, work, and achievement. In other words, the recently misplaced Puritan ethic. In 1980, between April and October, more than 125,000 Cubans sailed from Cuba's Mariel Harbor and arrived in Florida, bringing Cubans into the United States that varied demographically from their predecessors in what was deemed the Mariel Boatlift. As stated by academic Emily Skopp, the influx of non-white, lower-class émigrés complicates the stereotypical picture of the successful Cuban exile. These demographic differences, paired with reports that Castro was sending criminals and other undesirables to the United States, resulted in the belief identified by Scott that the Marielitos were young, black, unmarried, and that they were shiftless and dangerous people, prostitutes, homosexuals, mental defectives. In this, many deep-seated American prejudices, racism, colorism, homophobia, the stigmatization of disabilities, fear of political deviance, were compounded to project qualities Americans wished to eradicate in themselves onto Cuban immigrant others, thus providing more insight into the formation of American self-perception than that of Cuban American immigrants. Although some criminals and mental defectives did immigrate to the United States from Cuba in 1980, they were defined as such under strict Cuban definitions of criminality and mental defection, often not shared by the United States. Yet these classifications clouded perceptions of the entire Mariel Boatlift population, painting them all as undesirable and contradicting the fact that, as stated by Mariel Boatlift participant Mirta Oito, the 125 Cubans were mostly hard-working and many talented artists and intellectuals. This reality did little to combat the narrative circulating the American press that declared that refugees who fled the port of Mariel in 1980 have been linked to an unusually large number of crimes. In a 1983 article titled, "Violence Marks Cuban Refugee Crimes," hostile and generalizing public sentiment is apparent in statements such as, "They always seem to have guns," and "They have no fear of the penal institutions." Interviews demonstrate the deep feelings of resentment and tendencies to dehumanize Cuban immigrants, as Police Lieutenant Dave Warden asserted that these people are sociopaths, and Officer Frank Smaka said that they're just blights on our society, and they aren't even our criminals. The radical shift in the portrayal of Cuban Americans that took place in 1980 regarding Mariel Boatlift immigrants is a model of how public perception of Latinx immigrants is created and altered. In this, the reliance on pre-existing American prejudices reveals how the portrayal of Latinx immigrants tells far more about deep-seated American fears and suspicions, and the tendency to actively other groups that they stir, than about the identities of the immigrants themselves.